Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm going to kind of pick up where we left off before school let out. But before I get started, this is sort of like a warm up, if you will. All right. If you're paying attention to what's going on nationally, you know that the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates by a lot, close to zero. And they haven't done that since the recession that started in 2008. So, why? What is the intended outcome? What are they hoping happens? What is the Federal Reserve? We talked a little bit about it. So why are they lowering interest rates? What are they hoping happens? Feel free if you guys want to comment in the comments section for this video. You can answer that question. You can ask any question that you want, on anything that I talk about in the video. And additionally, you can access, resources and assignments and things that I'll occasionally refer to via my Google Classroom. You guys have been on there before. You've got the code, but it's up here too. It's G9AKF4. So if I reference an assignment or something like that, you know where to find it. You can also find me on Facebook, and that's linked on this YouTube channel. That is the only social media site I know how to use. So that is where you will be able to find me. Okay, let's get started. All right, guys. After ascending to power, Hitler started to work on implementation of what was referred to as the final solution. Minority groups in Germany, especially Jewish people, became scapegoats for Germany's problems. So, like a scapegoat is when you blame your problems on somebody, even if it's really not their fault. It's just convenient to blame them. And there was a lot of anti-Semitism, that term right there, in Germany. There were a lot of feelings of hostility against Jewish people because they were Jewish. And so they made this convenient scapegoat. And so Hitler blamed Germany's problems on them. And then the final solution was Hitler's plan to eliminate not just Jewish people, but people with Polish or Slavic ancestry, people with Romanian ancestry, homosexuals, people with disabilities, basically anybody that didn't fit into Hitler's definition of pure and Aryan were to be removed. And ironically, Aryan people lived in Iran, ancient Iran, and migrated to northern India. So they definitely weren't white or blonde or blue eyed. The Nazis were just kind of making this stuff up, right, as they went along. So ultimately, the final solution is going to be the mass extermination or attempted mass extermination of all of these groups living within Germany and beyond. So, as the Germans invaded territory across Europe, they applied this final solution in places like Poland and Austria. Ultimately, about 6 million Jewish people are going to be killed in these camps that we'll take a look at, and among them were 1 million children. So throughout German territory, there were about 850 what they call ghettos, which were essentially neighborhoods that were cordoned off that became prisons for people that were deemed sort of undesirable, and destined for removal. Right. So 850 ghettos, concentration camps, and slave labor camps. So the main purpose of the concentration camps were execution. So a lot of times they would take anybody who was sort of old enough or young enough or able-bodied enough to work, and they would use them as slave labor in munitions factories or mines or whatever. And for those folks that were too old or too young, too sick, not able to work, they would be moved to concentration camps, which pretty much the only purpose of the concentration camps was to murder them. We know a lot about what happened during the Holocaust because the Germans were so meticulous in their record keeping. You would imagine that if someone was going to commit such a tremendous crime against humanity, such an atrocity, they might be a little secretive about it. But the Nazis were very detailed in their record keeping and very systematic in their approach to trying to murder millions of people based on their ethnicity or sexual orientation or beliefs. And so you can see, in this image that this woman has a tattoo on her arm, and they actually assigned each of these prisoners, these people that were imprisoned in these camps, a number and tattooed them with it, marked them. They took pictures of everyone and kept detailed records. And so we actually know a lot about what went on inside of these camps, at least from a statistical perspective. Probably one of the more horrific aspects of the Holocaust was the Nazis' sort of mercantile approach to humanity. They took everything of value from the people that they imprisoned in these camps, and they would freeze their assets, of course, and take their money, take their homes and their valuables, but even down to individual possessions like shoes and watches and wedding rings, even gold teeth were removed. Anything that they could possibly take of value they took. And so you can see these shoes here are piled up, and these are the shoes of concentration camp victims. And if you go to the Holocaust Museum in DC, there is a room where you cross on a catwalk, and it's just full of these shoes, and it just has a tremendous. I would encourage you that at some point to go and see it for yourself. Here you can see in this photo, these are eyeglasses, and what value could they have? I don't know, but they took them because they could. They were literally harvesting these folks for anything that they had that was valuable. So as the Allies advanced, into German territory, they encountered, countless camps and liberated thousands of people and discovered that millions of people had been murdered by the Nazis in the implementation of this final solution. So there was a call to have a tribunal, a trial, to hold Nazi leaders accountable after World War II. And this is the Nuremberg Trials. The Nuremberg Trials held from 1945 to 1949. Hitler himself never stood trial. He committed suicide with his mistress in his bunker in the closing days of World War II as Russian troops were storming Berlin. In the picture below, you can see his second in command. That's Hermann Goering. Hermann Goering also committed suicide during the trials. He had a cyanide capsule that he had somehow snuck in. But many Nazi leaders were tried and found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And something that came out of these Nuremberg trials was a call for a Jewish homeland. And so by 1948, you're actually going to get the creation of the state of Israel. So if you think back to the Civil War, and we'll go way back to just a year before the end of the Civil War, 1864. You guys remember we talked about how war had changed, and the Civil War was an industrial war. It was a modern war, and so the level of violence and the effect that it had on civilian populations had dramatically increased, and so this led to, in 1864, some talks, the first Geneva Convention, where they made laws of armed conflict, which seems a little odd. Like, how can there be rules to war? Well, there are. And so a number of countries just agreed on some things, like we're not going to target medical personnel or hospitals. We're not going to target chaplains. And for our purposes, one of the biggest things that comes out of the Geneva Convention are rules for how prisoners of war, or POWs, that's what that term right there means, prisoners of war, must be treated. If you think about it, this is really important. If you want to prevent unnecessary loss of life, if you want to limit the destruction of wars, then you need to create a way for people to be able to surrender. If it's apparent that resistance is no longer going to achieve anything, you don't want people to all fight and die to the last man for nothing. So rules that govern the treatment of POWs let people know, like, hey, if we surrender, we're going to be treated. And the rules are that prisoners of war can't be tortured. They only have to provide their name, rank, and date of birth, and their serial number. Like for us, that would be like a social security number. They have to be housed and fed, and the Red Cross has to be allowed to visit POW camps. So, generally speaking, prisoner of war camps in the European theater during World War II followed the rules of the Geneva Convention and that treatment of prisoners of war. Whereas in the Pacific theater, Japanese prisoner of war camps did not. And one of the most infamous episodes of mistreatment of POWs in the Pacific was the Bataan Death March. Now, the day after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, they invaded the Philippines, which you guys should remember is a U.S. territory after the Spanish-American War. So there are U.S. troops there. There's about 75,000 American and Filipino troops that fight and hold off against the Japanese. They end up having to retreat. The Japanese invade the island, the main island, which is called Luzon. Uh, the Philippine Islands are an archipelago. Like, remember, we talked about Japan as an archipelago of 6,800 islands. The Philippines were an archipelago of about 7,100 islands. And the main island was Luzon. The Japanese took the capital city, Manila, on Luzon, and so the Allies, the Filipinos and Americans, retreated to this little peninsula right here. That's the Bataan Peninsula. And they actually held off against the Japanese for 3 months. So they fought and defended the peninsula for 3 months, but it got to the point where they were all starving. They were all sick. And so they ultimately had to surrender. And the surrender of the Bataan Peninsula was the beginning of the Bataan Death March. And so if you look, basically the Japanese organized the 75,000 or so Filipino and American troops into groups of 100, and they marched them 65 miles up this peninsula to railheads where they were then shipped by rail. They were crammed, just packed into train cars and sent to some really nasty prisoner of war camps. But even before they got to those POW camps, the march itself was just excruciating. And the name should tell you, Bataan Death March. And so thousands of American and Filipino troops died in this 465-mile march. Remember, they were already sick. They were already starving. If they couldn't keep up, they were bayoneted, just stabbed and left to die on the side of the road. And so there are many, many instances of where men who could physically no longer walk were picked up and carried by their buddies to survive this. But despite that, tens of thousands of troops died in this Bataan Death March. So just hours after Pearl Harbor, the FBI actually started to arrest Japanese Americans without evidence. They searched the homes of Japanese Americans without warrants. And so this sort of reaction to Pearl Harbor started almost immediately. Eventually, the federal government followed suit, and FDR issued what was called Executive Order 9906, which was just a blatant violation of the civil rights, of the constitutional rights of Japanese Americans. But it essentially it created military zones in California, in Washington, and in Oregon, and people with Japanese ancestry, about 117,000 people, were rounded up. They were given about 6 days to collect their things, close their businesses, secure their homes, and then they were sent to kind of collection centers. And from there, they were sent to relocation centers and held in internment camps and prison camps. So about 117,000 in the United States. Canada did the same thing. About 21,000 people of Japanese ancestry were in prison. And in Mexico, there were about 2,200 people who I believe were sent to the camps that were in the United States. None of these folks, and we talked about the Nisei regiments already, so none of these folks had any kind of evidence of loyalty to the Japanese Empire. This was a purely fear-driven mistake that was made. The relocation camps were not nice places. There were food shortages and all sorts of sanitation issues, and so people died. One elderly man who was frightened and tried to flee was shot. A couple was shot just for getting too close to the perimeter. And so there are many instances of people being killed, without cause. There's actually a Supreme Court challenge to Japanese internment. All right, here's my kids in the background. Say hi, guys. Okay. All right, there you go. Say hello. Here's your moment of levity. Okay, get out of here. All right. I'm talking to my students. Go back upstairs. Yeah, okay. All right, so anyway, a man named Fred Korematsu said, hey, this violates my Fifth Amendment rights. Fifth Amendment is due process, so we can't be imprisoned. We can't be denied our natural rights without due process. That's a trial by a jury of our peers, and we have all sorts of rights. So if you want to look more into that, check out that Fifth Amendment. And it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Okay, it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upholds it, unfortunately. It's not until 1988 that there's a presidential apology, and the passage of the Civil Liberties Act provides payment to the families of internees. Fred Korematsu actually received a Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1998 and spent the rest of his days working as a civil rights activist. So anyway, guys, you can read a little more about all this stuff in the 11 CDE narrative. So you go into Google Classroom, use my code G9AKF4, look under SOL 11 through 12, World War II. You can answer the questions and email me your answers. If you have questions about anything, you can just email me, or you can comment in the comment section of this video. Stay tuned. I'll be posting more of these. This is the last lecture for our unit on World War II, so I'll be picking up with the Cold War. So just to give you a little kind of looking ahead, as Russian troops and American and Allied troops are entering Berlin, as they're sort of shaking hands as East meets West, they're also already at war with each other. It's a war of ideas, an ideological war. It's going to be communist dictatorships versus capitalist democracies for the next 5 decades. And so we'll talk a little bit about the origins of the Cold War in our next lecture.